So my talk is entitled The Privacy Chimera. And it starts with an interesting question, which you guys probably weren't expecting, and I doubt seriously that anyone's used the word pornography in this room for at least 200 years. I asked this question because I want to talk about a French movie called Les Amants, which was made by Louis Malle, which was shown in Ohio in, I think, the 1960s, and in some local art theater. And the people in town, being conservative Americans, sort of went crazy, called the cops on the movie theater owner, shut him down for public display of obscenity. There was a lawsuit. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court sort of went back and forth on whether this was a First Amendment thing, what it meant to be an obscene production, whether or not this movie was obscene in the first place. In the end, it was deemed that this wasn't a pornographic movie. They should show it. It was, and so on and so forth. The case is called Jacobellis versus Ohio, state of Ohio being, the entity that was trying to shut the movie down. And Justice Potter Stewart wrote an opinion agreeing with the consensus of the court about why, you should be able to show a lot of stuff under the free speech right. And he debated hardcore pornography, and we couldn't define it. But in the actual opinion, he wrote, pornography, I know it when I see it. Why am I talking about this? Well, let's talk about privacy or data for a second. As we all know, there's tremendous amounts of data, personal data, they're distributed across clouds today. In fact, I don't think individuals can even fathom how much data is distributed across clouds. This data, as I always say in my presentations, makes companies like Google and Facebook exceptionally rich, but it's misused on a regular basis. And I don't necessarily mean it's misused maliciously. It's mostly used actually in under contract with the user. But if you explain to people what companies like Google and Facebook know about them, they're actually shocked that they actually disclosed behavioral information about themselves that allows these folks to peer into their lives the way they do. A lot of people like to say these things are privacy violations, but apropos my earlier point, it really does beg the question, what is privacy? By the way, if anyone's interested in seeing some of the art in my presentation, it's available in a small museum at the end of the street called the Louvre. This picture of a chimera, which is a mythical a creature in Greek mythology, is actually down in the museum. Homer called the chimera a thing of immortal make, not human, lion-fronted and snake behind, a goat in the middle and snorting out the breath of a terrible flame of a bright fire. A chimera is a multi-headed creature made up of many other creatures. I believe that privacy is a chimera. Privacy as a term, as a concept, suffers from a definitional problem. It's contextual, it's compound, and it's really hard to define, which is, I think, one of the things that makes privacy so hard to manage and regulate. And I hate build slides for this reason. Voila. So, definition of privacy changes in time. Definition of privacy is cultural. The definition of privacy has a lot of legal underpinnings that make it very hard to wrap your arm around. And obviously, technology plays a huge role in how we construe privacy in the digital domain. Privacy, I know it when I see it. So let's think about this as an issue we need to manage or resolve on the internet, both from a legal and policy point of view. I posit that by framing data misuse as a privacy problem, we're missing the point. Privacy, as I just said, is a compound concept. It's very hard to point at one act or one aggregate of acts and say this is a privacy violation or a misuse of something. And the reason is it's composed of how you collect, manipulate, analyze, deal with the analysis across all sorts of different contextual modalities. It's a very difficult problem to solve. Here's my best friend. Some people think that this guy is a liberator. He's enabled revolutions. He's allowed people to build relationships across time and space like no one's ever seen. He's challenged social norms. He's a liberator. Of course, a lot of people, like AOC in the US House of Representatives, think he's an exploiter. He definitely has very, very different opinions than most people about the way people should interact with each other and how data should be used. But it's not just Facebook. It's Facebook and Apple and Google and Uber and Amazon and everybody else who are out there just absorbing enormous amounts of information from people that are pushing the social contracts that exist between us to their limits and beyond. Tech companies, this is a quote by David Brooks in the New York Times, tech companies have created these platforms pretty much with the specific intention of drawing as much information about us as possible out of us. And they do it in very, well, I'd say subtle, but almost insidious ways. Brooks writes, tech companies understand what causes dopamine surges in the brain, and they lace their products with hijacking techniques that lure us in and create compulsion loops. There's at least one doctor in the house. There's probably several medical experts in the house if you want to talk about dopamine and what it does to you and why you crave it. Talk to Paul over there. He's going to be on the healthcare panel later. But these platforms are actually designed to get users to unwittingly click their rights away for free stuff. You know, social networks and messaging, maps, mail. You know, it's free. It's great. My life is so cool with my Android phone. In the beginning of this, you're always like, hey, is it okay if these are the terms, and a bunch of vomit comes up on the screen, and you're like, give it to me, give it to me, give it to me. But basically what we end up doing is admitting digital peeping Toms into our lives under contract. We're licensing our personal information to them. So in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a lot of people in policy circles and legal circles trying to play catch up with where technology's taken us. And laws like GDPR are a great start. GDPR, I call it, it's generally a reactive concept. It's like, here's a bunch of stuff you got out of somebody. Here's how you can use it. And I'm allowing you to do something with the data. Now, if you read GDPR, it's got a lot of stuff in it about fine-grained control and so on and so forth. But I mean, every time I'm in Europe and I click on a web page, I get one of these, like, we use cookies and blah, blah, blah. It's like, and I'm like, dopamine, dopamine, accept, accept, accept. I need to read the newspaper. And what these little thingies do at the bottom of every web page that pops up here is literally people say, give me the blanket right to exploit you in any way possible. Totally eviscerating anything that GDPR is trying to do. We're handing our information over just the way we used to. We're just licensing it legally with this little accept button. It's really hard to argue with a dopamine hit. So I'm a rights management guy, so I see everything as a rights management problem. And I see privacy as fundamentally a rights management problem. Mechanisms like GDPR are a pretty blunt instrument. They can become more fine-grained, but I really believe that what we need is a proactive individual right to data ownership. And I'll get into that in a little bit. Individuals should be able to own the rights to and license not really personal, but the observations that are made about them contextually, at a very fine-grained level. Now, there's a lot of complexity that comes with that. There's a panel on technologies that aim to sort of manage this problem specifically and make it easy to use. But, you know, fundamentally, if I'm walking around the internet leaving digital droppings behind me everywhere, I should be able to say, you can do this with these and that with those. And I actually believe that we should be looking at intellectual property rights, like patents for inventions, copyrights for creative work, to try to construe an almost an intellectual property right to the data we leave behind on the internet. We should also go further than that. You don't need direct information about yourselves. Nakayama-san was talking about how Amazon pulled back on some of their AI efforts, how Facebook and Google have issued policies on data ethics. Why are they so generous? Why are they being so nice? It's a great marketing campaign. What are they losing? It turns out not much, because you don't need first-order observations to know a lot about people. People are pretty boring. So by observing things around people, or by observing things about people who know people, you just square the circle. And you know as much as you need to know to place an ad or target an offer. Beware of Greeks bearing gifts. So AI needs to be governed. The results of AI needs to be governed as much as personal data. And I think in the limit, it's going to be some combination of GDPR-like regulation combined with a more explicit right to personal data ownership. And we have a great panel. It's not a panel. It's me and Ron doing a fireside chat. Ron Wheeler is one of my great friends and also a brilliant attorney. He's going to be speaking about the legal frameworks around how to define sort of individual rights with respect to data ownership. Let's talk a bit about context. Context is very important in how we construe privacy. Sociocultural norms impact how we define and manage privacy, not just across space, not between countries. Somebody in Saudi Arabia may view their personal information very differently than somebody in Norway, but also across generations. Everybody's got their favorite 16-year-old who does things on the internet we would never, or tells strangers on the internet things about themselves we would, in our old age, never think of doing. And that's really important. And encoding context and managing context digitally as part of these platforms and tying that back into whatever legislative framework arises is also super important. People should be willing to grant access in a way that varies contextually. What I would say to Nathaniel is very different than what I'd say to a government, and what I would say to somebody who's trying to sell me a digital camera, and so on and so forth. My relationship with my energy company versus my relationship with my doctor versus my relationship with iTunes are very different animals. But they're all about me. But I change. I'm a different thing in those different contexts. Now, here's another thing that I just want to get out there, just put in the back of your heads. I've been talking about how we should allow individuals who can read, write, and breathe to lock down or arbitrage or trade or sell or manage all this personal data. But what about the climate crisis? What about epidemics? Solutions to an epidemic could exist in these huge data clouds. Should governments be able to exercise eminent domain rights to limit or restrict or remove all of these things I've been talking about in order to advance social good or to solve a societal crisis? Most people would say, sure, we don't like epidemics, let's do it. Of course, when you realize that a government can define what a crisis is, that's a lot of power to be putting in the hands of any one entity. If you think through this personal data, and one of my colleagues, Tim Schaff, pointed this out to me when he was reviewing my presentation. He said it's a lot like the environmental sustainability problem. Once upon a time, or we still do in some places, we used to pour raw sewage into waterways. And the result was dying ecosystems and really smelly lakes and dead fish and all of that. Years and years of thinking through these environmental issues have caused us to put in place all sorts of regulation that gate where waste goes and how it's treated. The result is, clean waterways, beautiful ecosystems, but we still manage to get rid of our sewage. It's fine. And most people don't really want to think about it, but it works. We created a win-win situation. Today, we're dumping our data pretty much the way we used to dump our waste into these big buckets. And we don't really care what people do with it. And we've got the same sort of digital pollution that's going on that we had with environmental sustainability. And what we need is literally a movement akin to what happened to generate environmental sustainability in the data space. So, technology got us into this mess. I'm an engineer. I believe it'll get us out of it. What we need, in addition to legislation and the evolution of social contracts, is the deployment of a rights management layer underneath all of these data platforms. Something that allows you to control and manipulate personal data in a way that's consistent not only with the users who generated it, but the entire value chain that exploits it. Effectively, a trading and management system for personal data as it goes through its life cycle. A key requirement for this is fine-grained data governance. It's a platform approach. Data needs to be persistently managed everywhere it goes in a user-centric fashion. The person that generated the data is the hook. It's the axis. It's where X and Y meet. And everything needs to be managed around that person and the social contracts that exist around them. AI can run on top of a platform like that and can be governed and managed. The inputs to the AI and the outputs of the AI can also be governed. It's all data. And we can, of course, apply techniques like differential privacy, zero knowledge, and so on in the context of a platform. But no one of these things is a silver bullet. And we have a technical panel today with some of the most brilliant people on earth to debate the systems approach versus the algorithms approach. Or should we have an everything approach? So, by the way, another painting that's down the road. So viewing privacy as a set of elements that need to be managed is a key to a solution. We're nearing the end of the era of just dumping stuff into big buckets of ungoverned data, and we really need a platform approach to data rights management in addition to advancing the legal and social frameworks to solve the problem. So we've got a bunch of sessions today that try to deconstruct, compose, debate the problem. I encourage everybody here to participate. Andrew Odlyzko, brilliant mathematician, used to be at Bell Labs. He's now at the University of Minnesota. We'll kick this off with one of the coolest titles I've ever seen: Privacy, Confusology, Price Discrimination, and the Seeds of Capitalism's Destruction. By the way, Sato-san pointed out that Marie Antoinette used to hang out in these rooms. She was also decapitated right across the street. So debating the revolution that we're creating in a space like this is very apt. We go on, we have a brilliant person who's actually beaming in from Australia, Lizzie O'Shea, who's going to be giving a talk entitled Privacy, a Key to Avoiding Dystopia. Lizzie's given a lot of talks on the subject of the sociological and legal consequences of mismanagement of data. And then we move into panels. There's a computer science and privacy panel that's concurrent. Unfortunately, we had to do some of these concurrently with a session on the energy industry and the climate issues and how we solve some of these problems with data, and of course how we protect the data of the people we're collecting it from, not only people, but sensor data that's coming in. Paris is the climate city, so we figured a panel on this would be very appropriate. We then have a session on cross-cultural norms on privacy and data ownership to discuss context. And then Ron and I will, or Ron will mostly discuss, should there be a legal right to privacy? And from there we move on, discussing some Eurocentric views on security regulations, discuss the right to privacy from a human rights perspective. Should privacy be a human right? The UN's talked a lot about this. Nawaf will discuss what's been done and what's been ignored in this domain and what's needed. And then we have some distinguished colleagues from the Taiwanese government who will be speaking on what they're doing from a government point of view to protect their citizens in a data-driven digital age. And then finally, concurrent panels on healthcare and privacy, probably one of the most important places we need data management and privacy. And then more on the theme of international privacy policy and what's happening as GDPR filters across the planet and what different governments are doing across the world in that area. And then we'll wrap it up with discussions on human-technology interactions. And finally, the dessert will be a panel of people from the energy and the insurance industry discussing how all of these issues have been impacting the way they do business, the threats and the opportunities they see going forward. And that's the day. I'd like everybody to be interactive and engaged and ultimately just enjoy the day. Thank you very much.